Well, here we are, Husker fans, one day after the end of the Nebraska basketball season, just like 1 year ago when Nebraska's basketball season ended on a Wednesday night. And by Thursday morning, the world had shut down. This year, the sports world goes on. And so a year later, progress has been made, and we're happy about that. I'm Sam McEwen, along with Evan Bland. This is the Pick Six podcast for March 11th, 2021, which is a hell of a lot different than March 11th, 2020. How you doing, Evan?
What's going on, Sam? It is a lot different. Sun's out, sports are going on. Cannot lose.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot we didn't know at this time last year, a lot that was happening really, really fast. But the thing that remained true then as now is sports is resilient, and it has kind of come through a little bit of the fire. So we'll talk a little bit about our recollections from last year at this particular time. We will recap the Nebraska basketball season, which ended officially last night with a 72-66 loss to Penn State. A loss in which Nebraska kind of blew it, blew a 14-point lead, blew it fast too. I mean, they blew it within like 6 minutes. And then Penn State was able to hold on for that victory. And then we'll talk about Nebraska baseball. Evan's going to be heading up to Minneapolis this weekend to watch the Huskers in 5 games. Is it 5, Evan?
4 games.
4. And the good thing about these games is they're inside a football dome, so there is going to be no cancellation of any of those games. So they will play Iowa and Ohio State up in Minneapolis, and Evan will get to take a peek at the Minnesota Vikings home stadium. I've looked at pictures online of this baseball stadium as configured, and it's odd. It's an interesting stadium. It has some unique dimensions. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about that. But I want to start with, as always, our sponsor is Team Schwellenbach. The Schwellenbach Agency is a family-owned all-state insurance agency with 4 licensed insurance pros, saving thousands of Nebraska Husker fans money. They sell homeowner, auto, life, and flood insurance across Nebraska. They also insure all the big boy toys, motorcycles, boats, RVs, and off-road vehicles. If you've had your roof replaced in the last 5 years, give Daryl Schwalbach, Kyle Schwalbach, Nancy Mostek, or Kyle Murdoch a call at 402-590-5200. They can help you save a bundle. Free, no obligation insurance reviews and quotes. They're going to make sure all their fellow Nebraska fans are properly protected. Again, you can reach them at 402-590-5200 or www.nebraskaallstate.com. That is www.nebraskaallstate.com. Thank you to Team Schwalbach for their sponsorship of the Pick Six podcast. Okay, we're going to start with the end of, we'll start with, it's a year later. This is, we're 1 year into what most people know is the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, which in a lot of ways began with sports shutting down. The NBA shut down, and then college basketball shut down, all the NCAA tournaments and all the NCAA events shut down. And I think it was at that moment that it felt really real for a lot of Americans, is the moment that happened. And I recall that we were at the pro day for Nebraska football. We had just talked to the Nebraska coaches a couple of days before, and we were at the pro day watching Carlos and Khalil Davis and other former Huskers run and do drills. And we're talking to these guys, and I don't think any of us were wearing masks. None of us knew what was going on. All of us were talking about sanitizing our hands. It was a unique time. Evan, what are your recollections of that particular day?
Yeah, well, I mean, I remember when I was leaving pro day was when we saw that the College World Series had been canceled on Twitter. It was just like, wow, that was 2 months out. And it just felt in that moment like maybe that was a hasty decision. It didn't turn out to be, but that was a shock. But yeah, the football sequence, like you mentioned, 2 days earlier, we had those round table meetings with all the Nebraska assistants. And so we could go around, and I think we tried to make stories out of that availability for months, and we had no choice, right? Like that was never a topic of discussion, was a potential shutdown. So we were just talking spring stories and things like that. And then at the pro day, yeah, I mean, I remember Carlos and Khalil just kind of being asked about what was going on. They didn't have a lot of answers. Like you said, we were talking about sanitizing our hands. If I recall, the NFL scouts that were in attendance had been called back to their respective hometowns after that event. I think Nebraska's was the last pro day that people saw in person before the shutdowns hit. And I just remember kind of milling around with some of the other media that were in attendance too, and just kind of having this talk like, this might be the last in-person sort of interview time or access that we have for a long time. Even in that moment, it kind of felt like this was the start of something. You could see the tsunami kind of getting closer to land. And sure enough, that ended up being the last in-person access we've had with the football team since then. And I just remember leaving thinking how bizarre it all was. And that the last kind of whiff of normalcy that we had was at a Nebraska pro day 1 year ago. Just insane stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. I have many of the same recollections as you. I was there with you that day, and certainly thought that things were going to change somewhat significantly from a sports perspective. I think recruiting shut down maybe the next day. Then Nebraska sort of postponed its spring football practice. Remember that we weren't sure if they were going to play the spring game. You remember that Nebraska was like, well, for now we're going to postpone it. We might still play it. And then it became, well, we're not going to play it. And then it's like, well, we don't know, we're going to come back, so on and so forth. So there was all these different movements and moments. I remember talking to a recruiting guy on Monday following. So it was like March 14th or 15th or something like that. And he's like, I'm in a restaurant. He's like, all the restaurants are closing tonight at 10 o'clock, and that's going to be it. Like, they had these, like, we're going to impose our standards tomorrow or something. It was just such a fascinating time and moment in American history. And obviously there will be a lot to discuss as the years go on. There will. It's going to be memorable for a lot of different reasons. And as time goes on, the conversations will expand beyond even the ones that we've had in the last year. What I'll say for sports is sports was fairly resilient in all of this. And some of that might be because the sports leagues had to make money. But the NBA and Major League Baseball and NFL, they found a way to get things done. The NHL obviously is going now. The NHL did that last year as well. They found a way, and youth sports went on. I know my son played flag football in the fall. There were high school sports went on in many places. High school football wasn't played in OPS, but otherwise it was throughout the state. And it's striking me that that's one of the industries that remained. And that's one of the things that's sort of forged forward. And it's going to be criticism for that. There's going to be people who say, "Well, that shouldn't have happened. It was inappropriate. We should have been doing other things, thinking about other things." And I respect all that, but nevertheless, it happened. And most of the sports eventually got played. You feel for the athletes who lost the opportunity to compete in the NCAA championships last year and their senior years. Simultaneously, there's been so many different opportunities in the last year that you just didn't think were necessarily possible, and now have become that. So it's certainly a sad story of what's happened with the pandemic. You've also found that through science and the development of the vaccine, there's a certain level of triumph there too. Because I remember maybe a week or a month after things started getting, pretty bad, there was this, well, it's going to take 2 or 3 years for a vaccine. And that was the presumption. And we were all sort of, hunkering down for what might come. And science is pretty brilliant. They were able to start producing a vaccine by November, December. And a good chunk of our population has been vaccinated now. 2 months, God willing, most of it will be.
Yeah. And from a far less, serious side of things, have you noticed now that we're starting up again, there's so many qualifiers when we talk about sports history, and as sports writers, we try to put things into context. And like, even with some of this baseball stuff, it's like, I have to start saying, such and such over the last complete seasons because they played 15 games in 2020. We have to start qualifying everything to account for 2020 and how weird it was. It'll be the same for football when we start looking back on records and bowl appearances, and it's just eligibility. I mean, so much other stuff that is far less important than what you're talking about starts coming into play too. And I see that the Duke basketball team has had some positive COVID test and is out of the NCAA tournament. It just kind of strikes me that, man, if you would have wished a year ago as a Nebraska fan that the Huskers season would end the same time as Duke's, I guess you got what you wished for, but just not in the way that you had hoped for. So just a lot of weird minutia, I think, comes out of this year too, that's going to take a long time to kind of parse through and move on from. And that's just kind of a special thing unique to sports in some ways too, but happy to have a season back. And, we're not there yet, but we're getting closer, and hopefully by the fall, sports can be back to doing what they were supposed to do. And that's provide an outlet from things like politics and other things, as opposed to being a lightning rod for those things, which they largely have been in the last year. So
to some degree,
that can return.
It has been a little bit of a lightning rod. Yeah, at times, just playing the sports in general were kind of a big deal in that front. So yeah, we'll see what happens. Okay. So the Nebraska men's basketball team ended its season last night, 72-66 loss to Penn State. Huskers played one of their best first halves of the season, staked themselves to a 14-point lead. Penn State caught them quickly in the second half within probably 7.5 minutes. And then it was a close, competitive game all the way to the end. Penn State took a 4-point lead, I think, with 2:22 left. Never got much closer than that, but it was close and competitive. Huskers end their season at 7-20. Their record has to be taken in context with the historic play of the Big Ten this season. Best conference in America, one of the best conferences ever. You're probably going to see 9 teams make the NCAA tournament. And if Indiana were to win 2-3 games, which is unlikely, but you never know, then you could see 10. So that's pretty amazing when 9 of 14 teams make a conference, make the NCAA tournament. That's almost a lock to happen. It's very impressive. You could see 2 number 1 seeds, and quite honestly, you could see 2 number 2s. I think as it stands right now, I'm confident they'll have at least 1 number 1 and 2 number 2s. And then it could go up to 2 number 1s and a number 2. And then Purdue, if Purdue wins the Big Ten championship, Purdue's probably going to be a number 2 seed too. So extraordinary play in the league this year. Nebraska was 7-20, played 16 NCAA games against NCAA tournament teams, 16 of its 27. I think. I don't think Nevada or McNeese State are going to the dance, are they? I don't think so. But they played 2 non-conference games against Georgia Tech and Creighton, and they lost both those games. Both of those teams are going to the NCAA tournament, barring positive COVID tests. And then they played the 9 teams in the Big Ten. That's what I'm counting anyway. Michigan State twice, Maryland twice, Iowa, Michigan, Rutgers, Wisconsin twice, Purdue, Illinois. Who am I missing? I think that's everybody.
Yeah.
Ohio State. Of all those games, now, assuming that those are the teams that end up, I mean, we got to be honest. They really only won one of them. And that was against Rutgers. So although the analytics look really good and they're very solid and all the rest, they played a lot of NCAA tournament teams this year, and they really only won one of those games. And so in many years they would have done better than that. And I think there's a lot to work on. But what did you see last night, this season? You name it.
Well, I mean, I checked in for the first half last night and was, impressed early on with what Nebraska was doing. But it just felt like it was the same script over and over again. Either they fell behind and never came back, or they built a lead. And I checked in on that game last night, midway through the second half, got into doing some other things, but came back to it. And like you said, they had blown the lead. Penn State was up by a few points there at the end. And it's just like, I wasn't surprised. Like every game was that way. It was going to be close. Other than Rutgers, you just knew Nebraska was going to go into one of those patented scoring droughts. You knew they were going to live and die by the three. More often than not, it was the latter. It was an interesting development after Teddy Allen left the program to see how it seemed like they shared the ball a little bit more. It looked a little bit closer to what Fred Hoiberg had been wanting to do in terms of driving and kicking out and setting each other up for offense and things like that. But, ultimately it felt like it was the same thing. When I look at the team, it feels like they just need a talent upgrade still, and they need more chemistry together. And I know those things, sometimes it feels like those are mutually exclusive, where you're constantly trying to upgrade talent. And by doing that, you're turning the roster over and you're not able to build that chemistry. So it'll be interesting to see how much they want to turn over the roster here in the offseason. And maybe you have a better sense of that. But I guess I wanted to ask, you talk about putting this season in context. It kind of reminds me of football a little bit, where we look at this 2021 schedule coming up and see how historically difficult it is. And we've said, maybe the football team will improve, but it won't reflect in the record because of the quality of opponents that it faces. Is your contention then that this Nebraska basketball team was a marked improvement over the first year, even though the record is the same and ultimately the destination is no different than it was last year?
The analytics would tell you that Nebraska was a much better team this year. I obviously reserve the right to change my mind, Evan. But Nebraska's football schedule in 2021 is not as hard as Nebraska's basketball schedule just was, in my opinion. I could be wrong about that. I don't anticipate. There's a difference between names on a schedule. Ooh, there's Michigan, and knowing what Michigan is and isn't. Mm-hmm. And according to Ken Palm, the Big Ten has the number 3, 4, 5, 7, 11, 13. I could go on here. 30, 33, 35. And by the way, the number 35 team is 11 and 13 Penn State that Nebraska just played last night. It's not the same. So I don't anticipate Nebraska's football schedule being that same level of difficulty. People so the difficulty of Nebraska's basketball schedule is somewhere, it's kind of off the charts. It's close to as hard as certainly they've ever had. And they also had a month-long COVID pause in there. So that's something I also don't anticipate the football program dealing with. The analytics say that Nebraska was a lot better this year. I've kept track of some numbers, visually. I think I showed those to you last week. Nothing has changed about that. There's a visual picture that tells you that Nebraska is much more competitive than it was last season. That, there's some context there too. That team kind of gave up. I mean, there were some guys on that team that were checked out. And had they not checked out, maybe it would have looked different, but they did. And so I think Hoiberg's own comments about this team, the way that he liked it, he loved it coaching them, the effort that they consistently gave, the willingness to keep fighting despite horribly long odds, I think would indicate that they were a much more improved team. But of course, that narrative is now done. Like it ended last night, today, the next 3 or 4 days, and then you turn the page. Like it's not that story is kind of over, and now you start the new story. And I thought some of the things that happened last night were indicative of maybe some of the things that they want to work on. And of course, he talks about consistency and wanting to reduce turnovers. He's right about that. They had problems with turnovers last night. They had their share, especially in the second half. They had problems keeping Penn State off the offensive glass. That was a recurring theme with the program for many years. But also again last night, that issue predates Fred Hoiberg. But it's not his fault, but it is his now issue to resolve. They've improved as a team in terms of shooting the 3 ball, but I felt like their strategy last night was to hope they hit 12 of them. I wrote a tweet early, like this was before this is when they had only hit like a couple of threes. And then they went on to hit like 4 more in the first half. And I got a text from someone, oh, it looks like that. And I'm like, yeah, okay, well, we'll see how it turns out. But I think I wrote it's always possible Nebraska hits 12 threes tonight in the Thunderdome, which is what I was saying was the Lucas Oil Stadium. But somebody might want to get to the rim. They might want to get home at the rim. And they hit 9. If they'd hit 12, they would have won the game. But they didn't. They hit 9. And they didn't really get to the rim that much. They got there sort of. I mean, they hit 12 layups. Some of those were, fast break plays, or they were, putbacks. Derek Walker had one that was thrown right to him by a Penn State player, and he just laid it in. But I'm talking, when I say get to the rim, a guy gets all the way to the rim and he makes a basket. And Banton had 3 in a row like that midway through the second half. But those plays are fewer and farther in between. And let me tell you, when you don't get those plays at the rim, you better hit your threes, because you're probably not going to hit a lot of those pull-up jumpers. And, Nebraska doesn't have Kofi Coburn. They don't have a guy that can put his back to the basket and, work through a double team and make a 12-foot shot. They're going to have that player at least by the 2022 season. I can tell you that. They've got that guy committed, in Blaze Kaida. But he's not here yet, and he won't be here next year. And I don't know if Adoro Andre is going to develop into that, and I don't know if Derek Walker is going to develop into that. So some of the issues that they're going to have that they've got to try to resolve is how do you score when you're not hitting a bunch of threes? Like how do you get your points? They did some really nice things where they got cutters and things like that, and their spacing was pretty good, but they don't hit a ton of shots between 5 and 22 feet very often. That's just not who they are as a program. And that's okay, but you got to get more at the 5 foot. You got to get more consistent in there. Last night they went 12 of 21, a lot of shots blocked, a lot of shots altered. They get all the way there and they got to kind of pass it out. So those are tough things, Evan. Like getting downhill and getting to the rim is like a run game in football. The more you do that, the more the defense is leery of it. The more they sag into the lane to make sure you can't do it, the more you hit those threes. And that's part of what – there's a reason why teams run the pack line defense and they take it away. And they take it away because they know that if that part of the game gets going, that everything else gets going. Mm-hmm. And I don't think Nebraska consistently got that this year. They're probably looking for a point guard, so on and so forth. I could go on, and we'll write several pieces about it. It was my first year covering it, so it's a journey to some degree. I'm still learning a little bit.
I was going to ask you about that. I mean, it's your first year doing it, and it was all on Zoom. Like, how do you feel like that dynamic, just for you, played into that, covering the team on Zoom, watching it in an empty arena? Did it provide like any level of extra objectivity because you were a little detached, or did you feel like it took away because you weren't able to, be more immersed in what was going on?
It takes away. It takes away, Evan. It takes away. It takes away from the experience because you want to get to know the players and the coaches. You want to get a sense for them. I thought it took away from football this year too. Like, you get a sense of someone's body energy and body language and, just sort of personal vibe. And when you lose that essence, when you're doing it over Zoom, it just becomes harder. It's harder to pick up on empathy. It's harder to give empathy. I'm probably the reporter that asks the hard questions a lot of the time, across both beats. And so, that's not always I can ask the critical questions sometimes, and that's not always the fun position to be in. And over Zoom, it comes across as, you can be the guy that's trying to look at the negatives. But, I at the end of the day, the teams combined for 10 total wins. And of course, football's, there's only 12 games. But so you look at winning percentage, and, the winning percentage this year just wasn't real high. It was lower last year, I think, because they played 32 games in basketball instead of 27. But, these are tough times. But Hoiberg, again, everybody knew this was going to be a rebuild. Tim Miles gave it a really good shot, and one of his most talented teams just couldn't handle whatever. They had one guy get hurt in Copeland, and then it fell apart. Shouldn't have fallen apart, but it did. And so everybody kind of knew he was going to go. And when he did, there wasn't a lot left. He knew that. They were going to rebuild it. And I think he had a plan to do that. But they weren't going to be good last year if Tim Miles had been the coach. I mean, they weren't going to be an NCAA tournament team, more than likely. Yeah. And they probably were going to struggle this year too. I mean, I think part of Miles' long-term plan was to get Chucky Hepburn and Hunter Salas. And that seems to always be the story of like, well, just about the time the guy got let go is the time they were going to start getting the in-state recruits. I mean, Doc was going to get a Koya Gao, and Tim was going to get Hunter Salas and Chucky Hepburn. That's a good story. I don't know that that's true or not. It's hard to say. Those guys made the choices they made, but so I think Fred always knew that it was going to be kind of a rebuild. The first year was closer to year zero because they had to scramble to basically fill up their roster. And in doing that, I think they got a team that didn't have a ton of chemistry and just didn't have a ton of internal chemistry. It's too bad they couldn't keep Cam Mack. I think Cam Mack obviously didn't fit the program last year, but I think Cam Mack's a pretty good player and would have helped this team too. I think Cam's got a lot of ability and obviously didn't fit here. But, Cam to me fit Nebraska better than Teddy stylistically. Teddy Allen's a ball dominant player who probably fits somewhere else, probably not Nebraska. Cam, I think, did really, move the ball around and had the ability to get deep into the lane and all those things. So, they weren't able to keep him, and then they kind of started over again, and everybody saw the product. There were moments when it was really good. The one thing I would say for people to watch as Hoiberg has conversations with players next week is that the starting lineup and the minutes started to shift in the last 6 or 7 games of the year, and Thor and Kobe Webster can come back, and it's worth watching because if Thor and Kobe Webster decide to come back, then it's reasonable to assume that they're going to continue to move in the direction of incorporating those guys into things, especially Kobe Webster. I mean, Kobe Webster was, averaging 12, 13, 14 points a game in the last 5 or 6. So there's something there, and it's a good thing. And you don't necessarily want to – he started to really find that, all right, I'm a shooter, and I'm a scorer, and I'm going to try to make shots. And all of a sudden it started to feel pretty good with Kobe. So we'll have to see if those two guys come back. That's one big question. They don't have to. They certainly can, but they don't have to. And then you've got to have the conversations with some of the other guys whose minutes went away. So Ivan Ouedraogo's minutes kind of disappeared. He didn't play last night. As I recall, I don't think he played against Northwestern. And then Shamil Stevenson, his minutes kind of went up and down depending on the opponent. But I don't know if this is what Shamil Stevenson was looking for. When he came here to Nebraska, I think the expectation is he was going to be more than, a 5 point, 2 rebound a game guy who's averaging, I don't know how many minutes he averaged. So, and then, I think Delano Banton's going to be back, but at the same time, Banton went from being the focal point of the offense and sort of the point man to coming off the bench, and Trey McGowan's took over the point man role. And then last night, Trey said, I was recruited to play the on-ball position, to play the point guard position, and I'm going to start doing, you're going to see a lot more of that. And I thought that was a notable comment because, While that's true, Trey was a better college basketball player than Banton was prior to the season. I just thought that was notable that he said that, because he didn't really start the season as the guy bringing up the ball, but he did end the season that way. So those are the things to watch. Those are the things. And if Derek Walker is going to graduate, then in theory he can transfer without penalty too. My understanding is that he's going to be coming back, and he might be the most important player of the bunch, because they're a better team when Derek Walker's on the floor, a much better team.
Interesting. So do you know, I've seen fans put it out there too, like next year's the year. Like, do you get a sense for where it's going? Like, does this next
fans are impatient or they're hopeful?
Sure. But like when you look at the recruiting class coming in with some of the guys that they may potentially keep around, and the inevitable regression to some level that the Big Ten is going to undergo this year, like, how do you see that all coming together as far as Nebraska is concerned? Are they moving up to that kind of middle of the pack sort of bubble conversation next year, or where do you see it going?
Yeah, I think they can move up to the 8, 9, 10 slot, and once you do that, you're usually in the bubble convo. Yeah, I think they can do that. It's kind of dependent on who leaves, what pieces they can add, and how good Bryce McGowan's is. If he can come in and average 13 points a game, shooting 45% from three, it'd be pretty good. If he comes in and he averages 7 points a game, shooting 32% from three, they're probably not as good. I mean, some of it's based on the quality of your players. I think the Big Ten will take a step back. I think that's just probably going to happen. I don't know how much of a step back they're going to take, in part because a lot of these players can come back. Actually, everyone can if they want. So we'll have to see who decides they want to go. I think Luka Garza is going to go. I think it's time. But, I don't know how many of these guys are going to leave. Illinois will be different. Illinois is probably going to be a different program. They're going to lose a couple guys, but they were pretty good without Io. And they're really good, actually, without him. So I think Illinois is not going anywhere. Penn State's probably going to get a little worse. Northwestern is going to get better. Minnesota, they're starting over. They're going to tank. They'll go to the bottom. It's going to be a fight to get out of that 11 through 14 game, though, for Nebraska. It is, because Penn State's a damn good team. They're good. People do not appreciate how good they are. They were an 11. I mean, they beat Virginia Tech up one side of the court and down the other back in November, December. So Penn State's good. People look at Penn State and they're like, oh, no, they're a good team. And Minnesota was good before a bunch of guys got hurt. I mean, they were a top 20 team up to a month and a half ago. They were Nebraska 2 years ago. So these are all pretty good teams. And Nebraska doesn't get to change leagues. They don't get to play in the Pac-12. They got to play in the Big Ten. So I think the league will take a slight step back, but not significant. And Nebraska is going to really have to play some great basketball to make the NCAA tournament. I mean, it's such a challenge. Plus, you draw an ACC team every year. Plus, you draw Creighton every year. Creighton's going to take a step back. Creighton won't be as good next year. I will say that. Creighton's probably – they're going to have a rough go, I think, next year, because they're going to lose Zagorowski and they're going to lose a couple other guys too. So they'll be starting over a little bit. But I don't know. Let's talk baseball. I only have a few minutes here. The Husker baseball team rolled Purdue, lost the walk-off game, which I'm sure pissed them off. They probably should have won all four. They didn't. They went 3-1, dominated the last three games completely. Pitching looked really good. Now they play two teams that I think are closer to where Nebraska is, in Ohio State and Iowa. And you wrote a really nice piece yesterday about the freshmen. They're going to get tested, obviously, this weekend, a whole different level of competition. What did you see from Nebraska in that first and that opening weekend? And then what are you watching for this weekend when you're going to be up there and kind of watching them in person?
Well, yeah, like I wrote, the story to me from the opening weekend was the newcomers. I mean, at different points in that first weekend, Nebraska starts three freshmen on the infield. Max Anderson was at third, Jack Stile played Sunday at first and hit that big home run that iced it. Bryce Matthews was the second baseman. He played every game without an error on the infield and had a bases clearing double in one of the games. And that's hard to do. Like, that's hard to do anyway, but it's harder to do in a year like this when every team's roster is deeper than ever because guys didn't go pro, because guys chose to return for their extra senior year, super senior year, whatever you want to call it. To me, it's even more notable that those guys were able to do what they did right off the bat. And then you look on the pitching side, a number of guys came in mostly to strengthen the bullpen. Guys like Jake Buns, who started but went 3 innings. Cody Frank was a guy that had a good outing. Cam Wynn was a transfer from A&M who came in. Chance Roach was a guy from New Mexico State who thought his career was over a year ago, but the pandemic allowed him to transfer. And there he is, giving Nebraska a quality start on Saturday and going 6 of the 7 innings in that one 7-inning game that they played and won. So that was the most notable thing to me. And then you have the other guys on the team that you kind of know what they bring. Spencer Schwellenbach was very good as a hitter, as a fielder. He finished that game Sunday touching 97 miles an hour with a fastball.
He's special. Yeah, he's a great athlete overall.
It's going to be interesting to see what they do with him moving forward because they want to use him as often as they can on the mound, but they have to balance that with how he plays shortstop and his arm there. And they've even talked about down the line in a key situation starting him in a game. So we'll see how that builds up. But he's a guy I've seen now projected to go top 5, top 3 rounds of the Major League draft this summer. So this is almost certainly his last year as a Husker. And it's a shame because Nebraska missed out on him last year with just the 15 games that was cut short. So my sense is this is almost certainly his last year. And so it's going to be fun to watch him. But, you know, I think just big picture, you go 3-1 against a team like Purdue. That's not a good team. It's not a great team. They have a lot of seniors and they'll be competitive in some games, but that's what good teams do is you beat teams like that. They should have gone 4-0. Like you said, they blew 3 leads of 1 run. And then eventually got walked off Friday, but they came back and just dominated the rest of the way, which was impressive. And like you said, this weekend is different. It kind of takes a step up. Iowa is a really balanced team. Ohio State maybe has the best pitching depth in the Big Ten. I mean, they go 12 or 13 guys deep that they feel good about putting in. So it'll be a challenge for this Nebraska offense, which, yes, hit 5 home runs and showed some versatility, but it also struck out 46 times and did not hit in the clutch against Purdue. So we'll see kind of how that changes. But the defense was good. The coaches have believed that the defense might be one of the best, around, and they certainly showed that on the first weekend. Their only error this weekend was a catcher's interference that they had in the first game, which put a guy on. But other than that, they were flawless in the field. Their ERA is currently a top 10 in the nation sort of situation. So that you can see the pieces kind of coming together here. But so they've got 4 now in Minneapolis, 2 against Ohio State, 2 against Iowa. And we'll just see how it holds over. Purdue's offense is not good. They're one of the worst power hitting teams in the country. So how does the pitching staff hold up against Iowa, which has considerably more power, against Ohio State, which has a freshman named Cade Kern, who's going to be one of the top newcomers in college baseball. It's just a different challenge. And the turf there apparently plays a little slow. The dimensions of the park are odd. Like they push back the stands in right field, like where the stands would be along a football sideline. They just kind of push those back. I don't know exactly the dimensions of the park, but it's a very odd, kind of awkward configuration when they move those stands back. You can see the yard markers on the baseball field. There were games played there last weekend between some other teams. Here's another fun fact for you, Sam, and I didn't realize this until this week. This is Nebraska's home pod. So the Big Ten, in their creative scheduling this year, each team has a pod, a 3-team pod where the home team plays 2 other teams, and then those 2 other teams play. Nebraska is the only Big Ten school that is not hosting its own pod in its home city. So they're playing theirs. They are the home team this weekend at US Bank. Every other school has one in its own park except Minnesota, which has its at US Bank. So for the people out there who think the Big Ten is out to get Nebraska, here's a little bit more fuel for that. They also got some, by the way, when Max Anderson, who goes 8 for 15, doesn't get Freshman of the Week from the Big Ten. They gave it to like a Maryland pitcher who had a quality start or something like that. But something to add to the fire there. But for sure, this is a weekend where I think you get a closer sense of where Nebraska is in the pecking order in the Big Ten. And if they split or they go 3-1 again, then I think you start, viewing them as a top 4, top 5 type team. And then suddenly those games down the line against Michigan and Indiana get a little more interesting too.
Well, so somebody had to have the first home pod, right? And so I guess that was Nebraska or.
Yeah, they were given it early. This was their designated pod weekend, and they didn't feel comfortable having it at Haymarket because they had
wisely so. They wouldn't have played the stupid games.
Well, right. They had to make this decision. They had to make this decision a month ago, and with weather considerations. Plus, it's not just Nebraska playing the games; it's these other teams as well, and they didn't feel like the grass would be ready for that. So, so they're playing up in Minnesota this weekend, and they lose that. But ultimately, they end up playing the same amount of home games as everybody else. I think it's 16 home games, which is uniform across the league. So it'll be interesting. I did a little look, and this was their first set of indoor games since they were at Minute Maid Park in Houston 6 years ago. So kind of an unusual sort of deal for them to play inside. But, given how the Big Ten is set up their schedule, this is a way that they can get in games in cold weather. So that's what they're going to do.
Well, I'll be listening with interest. This is going to be an important weekend, I think, just because, like you said, I was a pretty prolific hitting team. And so I would think that Will Bolt is always going to have a pretty good offense, and they appear to have one. But it'll just be, that young pitching staff, how they do against Iowa and Ohio State. Bolt's offenses were pretty good when he was working under Erstad. I mean, that was not the issue with those teams. I remember them playing in the Big Ten tournament one year, and I think they lost like 10-9 to Michigan State or something. They just could not get guys out. So we'll see how that goes this weekend. What would success look like? I always ask that question. What would success this weekend look like?
Well, I think they at least 2-2. I think you got to split at the very least. The way that it sets up for Nebraska, they avoid Ohio State's big ace, Seth Lonsway, this weekend. So Ohio State doesn't even have a starter named for their Sunday game yet. And it'll probably be a bullpen game. But so, yeah, I think 2-2 would be the floor. And if you can go 3-1, that'd probably be the more realistic, optimistic sort of outcome that you could have for Nebraska. And then just, again, show signs that what happened last weekend is sustainable. Have a bullpen that can come through in high leverage spots, have some starters that can give you some run. I think Cade Povich bouncing back. He had a rough start. He's supposed to be their Friday guy. He had the shakiest outing on the first weekend, but I think he's maybe their best starter in that rotation. So I'll be interested to see how he bounces back this weekend. I think you can kind of attribute a lot of that to nerves because he was uncharacteristically wild. So that'll be something to watch. And then, again, the offense has a ton of talent. I think they can go 10, 11, 12 deep in terms of their lineup. It's just a matter of, can you put the ball in play in key spots instead of striking out? Like a sacrifice fly to left with runners on the corners is way better than striking out. They couldn't quite do that in the first weekend. Can you just come through in the clutch on occasion? And I think if they can, they have a ton of talent to go from there. So just continuing this thing, showing that what they did against a lower end of the league's team like Purdue that can carry over. And if it can, I think they're in this thing for most of the season. There's no reason to think they can't compete with some of these better teams, and should be fun to watch.
Yeah, it should be. Yes, it should. I look forward to that. It's on BTN Plus, right?
Yep, all 4 games.
I don't know how many fans sign up for that. I'd be curious. I mean, I have it, but That's for, I watch a bunch of different things on Nebraska, but are they going to have announcers this weekend? I heard that from a couple of fans. Like, yeah, this thing without the announcers is no good.
Well, you gotta tune into Husker Sports Network and listen to those guys. That's what I did. Anyway.
But it's not synced up.
No, it's not. You have to live with that a little bit. Although I think you can delay if you're like streaming the audio. You can delay that a little bit to try to sync it up. You're probably like 20 or 30 seconds behind if you do that. But no, the BTN broadcast did not have announcers, so I guess they were going for the authentic "you're at the park" feel with the crowd noise of the 20 people in attendance. And
I wonder if they will this weekend. I mean, the BTN has personnel in Minneapolis. They probably don't have anybody in Round Rock, Texas.
You think they're going to devote people to that though?
I don't know.
Basketball weekend and
with BTN Plus, a lot of times what you get are students. And right. It'll be the student broadcast, especially when it's women's basketball. And it's not perfect, but at least you know who the people are. Like people won't know who the Iowa pitchers are. Like it's just you might know who the Huskers are, but you don't always know. Like the detail that you're missing is like you're not going to know who Ohio State's best pitcher is. Like
that's fair.
So I'd be curious to see if they're going to have. No, I doubt they're going to dedicate it, but maybe they've got people up in that area of the country that can go call those games because there's only like 4 announcing crews working basketball this weekend.
Yeah,
2 on the men and 2 on the women. So I don't know. That'll be interesting to watch. It's odd watching it without because you don't really know the other team's players and they don't tell you anything about them. So it kind of reduces the anticipation or excitement, but whatever. I look forward to your coverage all weekend. I really do. And I know everybody follow Evan for more because he does a good job of kind of laying out the important details inning by inning on Twitter, which is an important function when you're a baseball beat writer. You got to do some of that. Because sometimes the games can go for 3.5 hours and, an inning might last 27 minutes and, you gotta, I kind of treat it like radio, like, it's like, oh, there it is. It's nice. Kind of an inning by inning, I've got like a little notification and it kind of pops up. I'm like, oh, look what's going on in the game. And then I might check in, that kind of thing. Like it's the Twitter in baseball is helpful. In football, we probably do too much of it. In basketball, we may do too much of it. In baseball, it's actually really helpful. It's like listening to the radio. So
it's a good point. Yeah, I agree. In football, like you can tweet something and like 10 seconds later, it's irrelevant because you've moved on to the next.
Right.
Who plays.
Right. Exactly. I like listening to baseball more than I like watching it on TV. I like kind of following it on Twitter. It's just nice background. Your background noise, Evan. I'm kidding. All right.
I'll take it.
That's all we've got for this weekend. I've got to get on a Zoom call with Nebraska coach Mark Manning. The wrestling team's going to be going to the NCAA tournament next week. They're awesome. They're number 3 in the country. We'll talk more about that next week. And we'll talk about the NCAA tournament. We'll have NCAA tournament picks, and we'll talk about winners and losers in that. And maybe, you never know, maybe we'll have some more Nebraska football or Nebraska basketball news. We didn't talk about Ernest Hausman today. You'll live. We'll live. We'll get around to it eventually. Thanks, Husker fans.